David Hume, the hypocrite of the Enlightenment. Let's rip the Band-Aid off. David Hume, the man who preached that every belief should be grounded in evidence, completely ignored that rule when it came to race. In his 1753 essay Of National Characters, he claimed, without a single fact, that black people were naturally inferior to the whites, and that no one of African descent had ever produced civilized art or science. It was armchair racism masquerading as philosophy. What makes it worse is the hypocrisy. The same Hume who demolished superstition used superstition to justify white supremacy. He demanded empirical proof for miracles, but none for human equality. His words fed colonial arrogance and scientific racism for a century. Scotland later removed a university tower that bore his name, not because he didn't change the world. He did, but because he chose to build part of that world on lies. Hume's brilliance on skepticism can't erase his bigotry, and pretending otherwise is cowardice. When you read him, remember, even philosophers who claim to worship reason can twist it into a weapon.
Immanuel Kant, champion of universal moral law, act only according to that maxim which you can will to be universal law, didn't include everyone in that universe. In early anthropology lectures written between 1770 and 1785, he ranked races like species on a ladder of worth, calling white Europeans the most beautiful and capable, and Africans the lowest stage of humanity. No moral law applied downward. He taught that the Negro was lazy by nature and should be trained by force. This from the man who built the categorical imperative. In modern terms, he divided reason itself by color, and wrote moral philosophy while drawing racial borders across it. Later in life, Kant claimed all people had dignity, but he never retracted his racist hierarchy. His universalism has a footprint shaped like Europe. It took later thinkers, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, to finish the job he refused to start, applying moral law to everyone. Yes, Kant founded modern ethics. He also helped philosophy inherit racism in polished academic language. Two truths can coexist, but only one deserves to survive.
Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the historian who erased a continent. You can thank Hegel for giving us the idea that history moves through human progress, but he defined human in the most conveniently European way possible. In his Lectures on the Philosophy of History, 1820s, he flat out stated that Africa is no historical part of the world. He claimed Africans lived in a condition of savagery and barbarism, and that the Negro represents the natural man in his completely wild state. That wasn't careless language, it was a blueprint for exclusion. By declaring that world history moved forward only through Europe, Hegel philosophically erased entire civilizations. Egypt? He shoved it into Asia to keep Africa empty. The rest of the continent? An intellectual blank space for colonialism to fill. Hegel's dialectic inspired Marx, existentialism, even modern social theory, but it also built the scaffolding for the racist idea that progress and whiteness were twins. Scholars still mine him for genius, but the rot is right there in the foundations. His vision of spirit rising through freedom excluded millions from the category human. That's not philosophy, that's propaganda dressed in Greek syntax.
Voltaire, the apostle of reason who cashed in on racism. The luminous voice of Enlightenment tolerance, the man who shouted "Écrasez la femme" against superstition, was perfectly happy to be superstitious about race. In his Essai sur les mœurs, 1756, he described Africans as animals, different from whites in soul and intelligence. He mocked the idea that they shared the same origin as Europeans, insisting their inferiority was self-evident. Behind the pen was a portfolio. Voltaire invested in colonial ventures and the slave trade. So while writing sharp essays about liberty and justice, he literally profited from people being bought and sold. The contradiction is radioactive. A moral crusader on paper, a beneficiary of bondage in practice. Modern admirers like to quote the quips and skip the cruelty, but honesty demands both. Voltaire's so-called universal reason was local, European, male, and lucrative. Strip the wit, and you find the same old prejudice with better grammar. His brilliance changed literature. His blindness helped justify empire. If the Enlightenment was meant to light the world, Voltaire aimed his candle where it paid best.
Arthur de Gobineau, the father of racial science and godfather of white supremacy. If earlier philosophers were casually racist, Arthur de Gobineau made it his life's work. His essay on the inequality of the human races, 1853 to 55, didn't just reflect prejudice, it systematized it. He claimed civilization was the product of Aryan blood and that racial mixing led to decay. It's one of the ugliest books ever to masquerade as philosophy. Gobineau's pseudo-science wrapped snobbery in scholarly language. He had zero data, just aristocratic insecurity and fear of equality. But elites adored it because it told them they were biologically destined to rule. His writing traveled straight into a propaganda of colonialism, segregation, and centuries later, the Nazis. He called himself a realist, yet his entire worldview was fantasy built on panic. Unlike Hume's carelessness, Gobineau's racism was deliberate, weaponized ideology. If philosophy seeks truth, his life's work was its opposite, a manual for self-delusion disguised as destiny. Alexis de Tocqueville, the liberal who drew a color line. Tocqueville loved freedom, as long as it was white. In Democracy in America, 1835 through 40, he admired the U.S. experiment but confidently predicted that the Negro race will never be able to share in the privileges of the whites. To him, black and white Americans were doomed to separate futures, one descending into ignorance, the other leading civilization. This wasn't fringe opinion. It came from the century's poster child for liberal democracy. The same man who defended political equality refused to imagine racial equality. He never questioned why slavery's wounds persisted. He simply naturalized them. Tocqueville's contradiction became standard liberal doublethink: liberty in theory, exclusion in fact. His racism wore civility like perfume. It shows why polite prejudice can be more corrosive than open hate. It hides behind compliments about culture and capacity. He mapped the American paradox of freedom and racism in ink that still hasn't faded.
John Stuart Mill, the libertarian who justified empire. Mill preached liberty and individuality with near religious zeal, yet in On Liberty, 1859, and Considerations on Representative Government, 1861, he argued that barbarous nations were not ready for freedom and could rightly be ruled despotically until they learned civilization, by which he meant British civilization. Mill sat at the desk of the East India Company for 3 decades, managing the machinery of colonialism. His humanitarian mask covered an empire's machinery of control. To him, self-determination was a privilege to be earned through Western approval. When critics call this paternalism, that's polite code for racism in a vest and tie. Mill didn't use racial slurs, he used developmental hierarchies that declared millions unfit for autonomy. His legacy is a mirror showing how even the champions of freedom can twist liberty into a leash. The empire didn't need to gag its subjects. Mill's philosophy did it neatly on paper.
Thomas Jefferson, author of Equality, practitioner of inequality. He wrote, "All men are created equal," while owning more than 600 enslaved people across his life. In Notes on the State of Virginia, 1785, he went further, trying to justify slavery by describing black people as inferior in mind and body. He admitted that this might just be prejudice, but kept right on writing it, then legislating from it. He freed a handful of individuals and still treated interracial unions as threats. His relationship with Sally Hemings, whom he enslaved, exposed the full hypocrisy, the author of Liberty maintaining one of its cruelest contradictions. Jefferson's Enlightenment ideals helped shape democracy. His racism helped shape its exclusions. Both truths coexist, but the latter still spoils the former. The man who proclaimed liberty for all drew the color line inside the same sentence.
Martin Heidegger, the philosopher who aligned with fascism. Heidegger's Being and Time, 1927, revolutionized existential thought. Then, as rector of Freiburg University in 1933, he joined the Nazi Party and stayed in it for years. He publicly praised the greatness of the National Socialist Revolution, denouncing intellectuals who resisted it. While he rarely talked directly about race, his speeches dripped with the language of blood, soil, and destiny, the vocabulary of racial nationalism. He encouraged the purging of Jewish colleagues, including his own mentor, Edmund Husserl, with nothing more than silence when they were later murdered. After the war, Heidegger never apologized. He wrote densely about authenticity, but lived moral evasion. His legacy forces philosophy to face its ugliest mirror. Brilliant ideas can coexist with moral blindness. No abstract noun redeems cowardice before tyranny.
Georges Sorel, the revolutionary who romanticized violence and purity. Sorel, 1847 to 1922, started as a Marxist theorist obsessed with myth and motivation. But his contempt for reason and his praise of creative violence made him an intellectual stepping stone toward both fascism and racial nationalism in Europe. He glorified the idea of the virile worker and sneered at decadent intellectuals, language that would soon morph into racial pseudoscience. Sorel wasn't ranting about race in every paragraph. He built a philosophical structure where force and purity were virtues. Compromise was corruption. Racist movements found in his writing exactly the moral license they wanted. He didn't invent their hatred, but he handed them poetic justification. He shows how philosophy goes toxic when it worships energy over empathy. Sorel weaponized myth against thought, turning rebellion into an excuse for exclusion. If someone's theory applauds domination, don't be shocked when it ends up cheering oppression.
Herbert Spencer, the gentleman who turned evolution into excuse. He coined the phrase survival of the fittest, then mistook it for a moral law. Influenced by Darwin but eager for hierarchy, he argued that lower races and poor classes simply represented less evolved forms of humanity. Any attempt at equality, he claimed, interfered with nature's progress. He wasn't shouting hate. He dressed it in logic and manners. His social Darwinist gospel justified colonialism, segregation, and industrial cruelty by calling oppression natural selection. For decades, politicians quoted him to oppose social welfare bills and celebrate imperial conquest. Spencer claimed to love liberty, but his version left most of the planet outside its circle. He proved that you don't need slurs to be racist, just the theory that defines compassion as weakness. Under the velvet of science, he built a hierarchy harder to dismantle than chains.
Carl Linnaeus, the classifier who put race in taxonomy. He gave biology its elegant system of Homo sapiens and Latin names. He also quietly stitched racism into science. In the 10th edition of Systema Naturae, he divided humanity into 4 varieties: Europaeus albus, Asiaticus fuscus, Americanus rufus, and Afar niger. Each assigned stereotypes like governed by laws, ruled by opinion, or sluggish. He meant it as classification, not politics, but his tidy Latin became ammunition for centuries of racial ideology. By codifying difference as essence, Linnaeus turned prejudice into data and gave slave owners a scientific alibi. He never imagined how poisonous his table would become. Yet intent doesn't erase impact. Linnaeus proves that bias can hide in the brackets of brilliance. One man's taxonomy of life hardened curiosity into categories and helped the world mistake color for kind.
Volkmar Sigmund Wagner, the mystic who romanticized purity through myth. Richard Wagner's operas thundered with revolutionary beauty, but his prose seethed with racial paranoia. In Das Judentum in der Musik, 1850, Wagner claimed Jewish people could not create true art because they lacked an authentic national spirit. He framed German culture as racially pure and morally superior, a foundation the Nazis would later worship. What mattered wasn't melody, it was lineage. Wagner's insistence that genius and blood were inseparable fused art with Aryanism. He never wrote systematic philosophy, but in essays, diaries, and letters, he wrapped hatred in aesthetics, turning beauty into a barricade. Philosophers such as Nietzsche started as admirers and recoiled once they saw where that mythic purity led. His legacy shows how racism doesn't need explicit policy. It can hide in romantic metaphor. Wagner transformed prejudice into opera, proving that the most seductive lies are sung, not shouted.
Houston Stuart Chamberlain, the prophet of the Aryan Gospel. English-born Chamberlain wrote The Foundations of the 19th Century, a massive hymn to German racial supremacy. He lifted Hegelian fluff, Gobineau nonsense, and Wagner's nationalism, welding them into what he called a philosophy of history. He painted white Europeans, especially Germans, as God's chosen type, everything else, including Africans and Jews, as evolutionary detours. It read like a theological textbook for superiority complexes, and Kaiser Wilhelm II adored it. A generation later, so did Adolf Hitler, who called Chamberlain's book the Gospel of the Aryan Race. Chamberlain is the missing link between drawing room racism and genocidal ideology, philosophy writing itself into atrocity. He proved that when bad thinkers dress bigotry in scholarship, the damage lasts beyond their graves. Chamberlain's polite racism wasn't fringe, it became policy.
Ernst Haeckel, the evolutionist who ranked humanity. Germany's most famous biologist-philosopher made Darwin simple for the masses and toxic in the process. He drew evolutionary family trees placing woolly-haired Africans closer to apes than to Europeans. He called colonization a biological necessity and declared that exterminating inferior races would advance civilization. He blended biology with philosophy into a worldview he called monism, a single natural law that conveniently rationalized imperialism. His charts appeared scientific, but they were racist fables dressed as data. German nationalists later waved them as sacred proof of racial destiny. Haeckel's work shows how a mind can worship reason, yet weaponize it. He turned living diversity into a pecking order and named prejudice natural order. If Darwin opened minds to evolution, Haeckel chained it to hierarchy.